Hello, AP. This is the last of your lectures on the new material as we are finishing this up. Starting next week, we will be on review after Tuesday. That is my goal. It might be a little bit of a long one for modern Europe, but that should be the end of all the new material. So this is World War II. Basically, what we know: Treaty of Versailles pissed everybody off, namely the Germans. This is going to cause the future resentment. That's that stab the dicta piece, which is going to help Hitler rise to power, the stripping of the German military in the treaty, the loss of German territory, which is going to feed his Lebensraum. We're also going to see the huge reparations. To kind of maintain the peace, the League of Nations is going to be complete and utter failure. It has no real power, and two of the major players, the United States and the Soviet Union, neither one will join. And then, of course, the Washington Conference, there's these kind of a succession of treaties that are passed and meetings that do nothing but actually make it easier to cause a war, because the naval conference limits the number of battleships someone can have, but not aircraft carriers, which the Japanese, of course, capitalized on. And then, of course, you have Locarno, which was this made it so the Germans actually looked like they had caused the war. And then on top of it, the Kellogg-Briand Pact allowed this idea that you're going to make war illegal, which how can you make war illegal? And the actual fighting of the war actually starts in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And then Hitler who had been, because of Locarno, had Germany under Straussman, had been able to join the League of Nations. Now Hitler's going to pull out of the League of Nations and start the German rearmament that we saw during the last lecture. Okay. There are couple conferences like the London Economic Conference in 1933, where we're going to see the idea of trying to use an economic way to tie all these European countries together and stop an international conflict, but that's not going to happen. And then the Stresa Front in 1935, at first, Mussolini and Hitler are actually at each other's throats. They will both withdraw from the Treaty of Versailles, but when Hitler plans on moving into Austria, it kind of freaks out the Italians, and at first they're kind of against each other, but then eventually they are going to join up with each other and form what we call the Axis powers. We're going to see in 1935 the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians. The League of Nations, of course, will pose sanctions against Italy, but that's about all they're going to do. When the leader, here's Haile Selassie, goes to the League of Nations and says, hey, we've got to do something about Mussolini because he's going to come after you next. And they go, well, we'll put some sanctions on them and talk badly. And then they just take Ethiopia anyways. So that worked out real well. And in Spain in 1936 to 39, Hitler and Mussolini are both going to throw in support. Franco is going to cause a coup to overthrow the communist-leaning government in Spain. Hitler sees this as an opportunity to test his weapons. And so Mussolini and Hitler are going to supply military forces and ground forces to aid Franco. Now, when we call this the war to end fascism, it's actually kind of wrong, because this is actually Franco survives in power until 1970s. And hence part of the reason why Spain is fighting for the economic problems it has today is because there were sanctions on Spain for a long period of time because Franco was in there. So one of the ways they're going to test is the Luftwaffe is going to bomb the city of Guernica, that they said they could bomb the city of Guernica out of existence to prove that bombing could be a way of fighting wars. This is the beginning of that, what we call total war strategy. And so this portrait painted by Pablo Picasso is called Guernica, and it shows the idea of this strategic bombing and the killing of the people, the innocent people in Guernica. Franco is going to end up winning this war using German technology, and he ends up turning it into a fascist state. Berlin and Rome then become the Axis powers from this. And then, and also this is issues. There's a split in the government led to a fall of the leftists because of the support and against this by the French. So now this becomes the Lebensraum. Hitler is going to try to do that whole idea we talked about, like Grossdeutsch, Kleindeutsch, concept that Bismarck had done Kleindeutsch, was just the German states. And now Hitler is going to do what we call the Großdeutsch, where we're going to put all Germans together. So the Bloom, because of the torn government in support of Franco and the loyalists in Spain, Bloom's government in France had collapsed. England, of course, was torn economically and politically by the whole Great Depression, and so no one's there to stop Germany. So the first place he's going to move into, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, is the Rhineland, which is this territory right here. And if you can see the whole chart, these are all, this is Germany, what they had from the treaty. These are German-speaking areas or German nationality areas. So first place he's going to move into is the Rhineland right here. And when no one does anything to stop him, well, let's go back one. Sorry. Here we go. There we go. Moving into the Rhineland, he sees that he's kind of has the carte blanche, that the French don't do it. Now, the French actually do look at the British and go, hey, what's happening over here? And the British go, kind of shrug their shoulders and go, well, you know. And so Hitler is able to move in there without French resistance, which then gives him the idea. Now, there were people in the German high command, generals, that if the French had moved against him, they may have actually assassinated him and staged a coup. So, but this is the beginning of this idea of this expansion of German Großdeutsch, which is the next step after Kleindeutsch, which was Bismarck. Okay. Japan is going to move in. We're going to see their invasion of China in 1937. This is the rape of Nanjing, which the Japanese downplay still today. But just the atrocities. I mean, women are raped and murdered. They're lit on fire. Children are executed. I mean, they decapitate civilians. It's brutal. It is brutal. That's called the rape of Nanjing in 1937. And then Hitler then is going to, like we said, he wants to expand this idea of Lebensraum, to expand the living space into the east and replace what we call the Untermensch, these subhumans, mostly Slavic people, which are Russians, Poles, people like that. That's who he's talking about. And the Anschluss, he basically tells the Austrian government, I'm coming in. And he sends a letter to them saying, I'm coming in. There's a pro-Nazi government already in Austria, not wanting a conflict with Hitler. They quickly turn over power to him, and he basically goes in without firing a single shot. What it took Hitler 5 years to do in Germany literally took 24 hours in Austria. His next move is the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which is the Bohemian area that borders what is modern-day Germany. Then what they're going to hold is what we call the Munich Conference. So Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, will try to appease Hitler. This is where the term appeasement comes in, where they're making concessions to stop an aggressor. And so what they do is they meet in Munich. And at first, this does not succeed. And the second time, he goes back and they negotiate. Him and Hitler and Mussolini negotiate, and they come to an agreement that they will basically turn over the Sudetenland to Hitler for a promise of no more military actions or invasions. And Chamberlain goes back and claims he has peace in his time. So this appeasement idea of giving in to make concessions for peace, it's not very popular anymore in history. At the same time, and then in 1939, Hitler goes, yeah, what agreement? And then he invades the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939 in spring. At the same time, in August, they're going to sign, in August of 1939, Hitler and the Soviets are going to sign a non-aggression pact, which you can see in this cartoon, they're mocking. Now, why would the Soviet Union, who hates fascism and hates Hitler, and on the other side, Hitler, who hates communism and hates Stalin and wants to literally eradicate every single Slavic person on the planet, why would they sign a non-aggression pact? Well, here's why. One, they're going to split Poland. So Stalin's going to invade on one side, Hitler's going to invade on the other. That creates a buffer between the two. Two is that both sides don't want a front there. Hitler doesn't want two-front war when he goes against the Western Europe, and Stalin needs to buy time. Even though they've been running the 5-year plan, there's no way militarily he is ready to fight something like the German army. So this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that's been negotiated between the USSR and the German Reich gives them time. One can carry out his one front war. They both know they're coming after each other. It's just a matter of time. And then on September 1st, 1939, Hitler breaks any type of truce or any warnings that the British and French give, and he invades Poland, starting World War II. And of course, Britain and France then declare war on Germany. And this is what it looks like. This is European theater. This is that Sudetenland right here. And then he gets all of Czechoslovakia, and then he just takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. He's going to invade Poland, and the Russians a few months later then will take out all of this part of Poland, and then also take out all this, and part of this. So how Hitler's going to do this is what they call blitzkrieg. A blitzkrieg is a lightning war. They use fast-moving vehicles, tanks, jeeps, paratroopers, and then aircraft to take out the enemy targets, and then they'll move on from there. With ground forces. Stalin will invade Finland. He'll annex Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania while he's at it. And that's to create that buffer zone from the Nazis. And then we start what we call the Sitzkrieg, which is this phony war, which basically for 7 months, there's like this lull that nothing happens because it's like Hitler's kind of going, all right, now what? Are they coming after me? And then, of course, the Allies are like, now what's he going to do? And then that's when it starts. Hitler invades Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. He's on a roll here, people. And then, of course, he invades France. In 6 weeks, he's going to take out the French and get into Paris. While he's taking a grand tour of Paris and soaking in his greatness, the British and French armies will retreat at a place called Dunkirk, where they'll actually use every type of possible vessel you can think of. Rowboats, sailing boats, tugboats, luxury boats, everything you can possibly imagine to evacuate the French and British armies, giving them something to fight later. France then becomes a divided state. The Vichy, which is this area down here, becomes a sympathizing state. Basically, it's a puppet government, which is pro-German, pro-Nazi, but it's independent. In other words, it can operate by itself. The northern part is German occupation land, where it's basically under German rule. The real government of France then becomes under de Gaulle, who has fled with this whole army back to England from Dunkirk. And this is where you see the Axis powers are formed. Japan then joins with Rome and Berlin to form the Axis powers. And that begins Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of England would have been next. A couple things go wrong. The Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring says that they can bomb the British out of existence. They start with the British airfields and knock out the RAF. That works out great until the British get a crazy idea of bombing Berlin, which thoroughly pisses off Hitler. And with Hitler then switches over from bombing the airfields and strategic locations to bombing London, which was a fatal mistake for him, not for the German or for the British, because the Blitz then, which this is the Blitz or the Battle of Britain, when he shifts from the airfields to bombing the cities, that allowed the British then to get their planes off the ground. Also, what he doesn't realize is the British have a couple other secret weapons. Is one that they had from a submarine, a German submarine, had gotten their hands on an Enigma machine. So they kind of know what the Germans are doing because they can break their codes. The other thing is the British have something the Germans don't, radar. They can tell to a degree where German planes are coming from. And, of course, there's the British kind of resoluteness, the idea that they can stiff upper lip, they can survive this. So Goering's plan to bomb the British people into submission doesn't work. If anything, it actually made them want to fight harder. And then on top of it, the fact that now their airplanes can get in, they can decimate the British, the German air power, which then made Operation Sea Lion useless. So there goes Operation Sea Lion. All right, which then Hitler can't invade Germany, or I'm sorry, he already invaded Germany because he's taking over power in Germany. Sorry, Hitler can't invade England because Operation Sea Lion has now failed. So now he switches over to hit Operation Barbarossa. In June of 1941, he's going to invade Russia. So Russia then, but his type of warfare in this place is totally different than you've seen anywhere else in world history. It is scorched earth. They destroy everything in their path. And so what they're going to send in is that these Instandgruppens, which are the SS killing squads. So they'll go into a town. In most places, like in Belgium and places like that, the SS comes in and they round up the people that are Jews and politicians and that, and they liquidate them. Here, the Instandgruppen is killing everybody. They'll round up an entire village, put them into a barn, and then board it shut, burn the barn to the ground. And if people get out, they'll machine gun them down. By winter, they've laid siege to Leningrad and later Stalingrad, which are the most vicious fighting in the entire war in Europe. It is house to house, street to street, vicious, cold. It's so cold in Russia during the winter that tank oil actually freezes inside the tanks. People are eating sawdust and rats and cats and dogs and everything else you can possibly imagine. And this becomes the great patriotic war of the fatherland and sets the tone for why the Russians will react the way they do when it comes to the Cold War. At this time, the British and the French, or the British and the Americans, will then work together. You're technically out of the war. Remember, you have those things called the Neutrality Acts, which are keeping you out. However, Churchill and Roosevelt meet and form this thing called the Atlantic Charter out in the Atlantic on board their ships. And this basically promises that if the United States were to go to war, that we would side with the British and fight in Europe first. And then, of course, it also sets the stage for what we call Lend-Lease, where we're loaning weapons to the British and to the Soviet Union even to help fight the war. So basically, we were, by 1941, not really neutral. We're kind of quasi-neutral. So, but we're into this. The Japanese are going to keep expanding. The Japanese see this as a holy war. They believe that they are a higher chosen people by God, and they want to expand their sphere of influence and take out all the European spheres of influence, hence the invasion of China. And so you're going to see where they believe they're boxed in. And so that's going to cause them to push out. They're going to take out, obviously, Hong Kong and other places. But on December 7th, 1941, America is pulled in the war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which actually pulls you in. And so this is another foolhardy mistake. Hitler's mistakes were in the bombing of London and letting off the airfields. And then the invading of Russia takes up so much manpower, because not only are you liquidating the Jewish population, but you're at the same time liquidating the Slavic population. And it turns into this kind of grind that's grinding up, right? Pearl Harbor is kind of the same mistake, is that by provoking the United States, not a single bomb falls on the United States. Really, well, okay, there were some fire bombs that were spent by balloons, but for the most part, America is left unscathed, which means then that you can produce things at a massive rate and just bury the Japanese and the Germans. So that's why this all kind of fits in. Okay. Japanese not expecting you to surrender, then push your soldiers on what they call the Bataan Death March. They march them from one area of the Philippines to the other, killing thousands of POWs. And it's partly the Japanese don't have this concept of surrendering because they're fighting. They've hijacked their own history and brought it to the modern age of this samurai. And this is later going to cause, because of these atrocities committed both in the rape of Nanjing and the Bataan Death March and other incidents, are going to lead to a Nuremberg trial type concept in Asia, just like we're going to see in Europe. U.S. enters the war, forms a grand alliance with the Britain and the Soviet Union, of course, France. This is what it looks like. This is Nazi Europe. And so the Nazis then are, because they've invaded and brought in, they have this huge Polish population. All the things we've been talking about as populations were pushed into by Russia, into the pogroms, in other words, pushed into Poland in the 1900s. You had the Reconquista, which is going to cause the migration of Jews to Eastern Europe into the Polish state, into Poland when it was a nation. So all this had then basically pushed Jewish populations into this. But it's not just Jews. He also wants to liquidate Ukrainians and Russians, basically any population that he sees as subhuman, gypsies, Jehovah Witnesses, all these people, and communists are all people he plans on liquidating. And so this is what becomes the final solution, and in the Holocaust. And in Russia, he's just slaughtering entire villages, entire cities. They are ordered no surrender, no at no cost, that they are to kill every single Russian in their process. So, and it's also the thing to understand, it's not just Germans that are participating. Austrians are participating. Poles are participating. That Anne Frank is turned in by by people in her own country, by her neighbors, to the Germans. So it's not just Germans are doing this. That there are others that are siding with the Germans and participating in the Holocaust. So on the home front, it's all in. The industry is we're going to basically take over factories, propaganda, and censorship. In America, Disney becomes one of the major propaganda machines. In England, the king goes on and gives speeches to rally the troops. You're going to see rationing of food and materials that are needed in large amounts. The turning points of the war, one, El Alamein, is that the German General Rommel, trying to take the Suez Canal, fails epically and is pushed out by Montgomery and Patton. That leads to Operation Torch and the invasion of Italy. By 43, Germany had basically been pushed out of Italy. And you're going to see eventually the fall of Mussolini in Italy. And the beginning of this is obviously Operation Torch in North Africa is going to lead to the invasion of Italy out of this. Stalingrad in December 1942, the Nazis are going to be bogged down in this cold, frozen wasteland. And then they now have to they're trying to take the oil supply, and also because the town is named after Stalingrad, and it's through the Caucasus Mountains, but it's going to fail. And the Germans are going to lose an entire army in the battle for Stalingrad. And later in 1943, you're going to see the Battle of Kursk, which is the largest tank battle in history. By 1945, Soviet forces are going to be on the outskirts of Berlin. So they go from Stalingrad and Leningrad almost being taken and being some of those brutal fighting of the war, that after Kursk and the other victories at Stalingrad and Leningrad, that by 1945, Soviet forces are going to be on the outskirts of Berlin. And there's Stalingrad. The other points of interest, obviously, turning points, is the invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943. It opened up another front on the Germans. And then, of course, that's going to lead to the eventual defeat of Mussolini and his death by his people's hands. And, of course, the biggest turning point for Europe is the D-Day invasion, which is the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Now, Churchill wanted what we called the soft underbelly strategy. Churchill wanted to go up through the southern part, through Greece, Yugoslavia, Italy, and because his plan was that he could do a two for one kind of concept, that he could cut off the Soviet approach on one side, and on the other side, and then at the same time stop the Germans. So it was kind of a two-part, kind of prevent the Cold War from happening, and at the same time stop Germany. Russians just want a second front. And then obviously their policies are going to be manipulated by what comes after during the Cold War, which we'll talk about on Thursday. The other thing that you're going to see out of this is obviously the Americans, they just want the war over, which this was the easiest way, is that this opens up a second front, which takes us straight to Berlin. And so we won out because we're the one paying the bill. So D-Day, all right? And then, of course, the Germans are going to make one final push, which is going to be the Battle of the Bulge in 1945. Hitler makes one last push to try to stop the Allies. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because most of it's concentrated on the 101st Airborne Division, and they bulge. The line moves back, but it doesn't break. That will lead, obviously, into 1945 with VE Day, with victory in Europe. Basically, Mussolini is captured by his own people. He's beaten, shot, stabbed, burned, and ran over by a train. Him and his mistress are. I think I got all of them. This is after he'd been deposed, and Germans put him back into power, and then he deposed again. And then in Germany in 1945, Hitler commits suicide. His Goebbels, the propaganda minister, kills his entire family and kills himself. Hitler attends his own wedding. Then he kills Eva Braun, his new wife, and their 2 dogs, and then takes cyanide himself, and then puts his pistol to his head and kills himself. So for Japan, well, turning points here is the Battle of Midway. So after Coral Sea, where we basically stopped the invasion of Australia, that the Midway is the turning point because we basically catch the Japanese fleet flat-footed, and we're able to wipe out the entire well, not the entire, but a good portion of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet, which then allowed us by 44 for MacArthur to liberate the Philippines, and then eventually we start our island hopping campaign from there, moving closer and closer to the Japanese homeland and moving our bombers closer and closer. Japan, obviously, after the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa, which are some of the bloodiest battles in the entire war, the Japanese, basically without resources and without the capability of continuing the fight, are going to see that they basically start resorting to kamikazes because they are not going to surrender. Now, there's a lot of debate over that Japan was actually close to surrender. Economically, they're running out of supplies. They're running out of fuel. They're running out of natural resources, especially since the person they attacked to get us out of their sphere of influence was the United States, was one of their biggest suppliers of oil and materials, which is why they attacked you, because they wanted to get you out of their sphere of influence so they could be independent. And now you've taken all the things that would give them those resources away from them, and now they're running out of those things, resort to kamikazes. But there is debate that whether the atomic bomb was even needed, that Japan would have basically been able to be starved out. But the problem is that would have led to a Russian invasion of northern Japan and possibly divided Japan, much like you see divided Europe. And that, of course, led to what we call the Manhattan Project and the development of the first atomic bomb. In August of 1945, we'll drop the first bomb. August 6th, we'll drop the first bomb on the city of Hiroshima, and then obviously the second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. The first one was Little Boy, and the second one was Fat Man. By April 10th, facing no possibility of victory and the possibility of total annihilation, Emperor Hirohito then resigns. Which the interesting thing is that the Japanese offered to surrender unconditionally, except keeping the emperor in position, and we rejected that. And then after 2 atomic bombs, we offered them the exact same peace they offered us, which makes you wonder: were they doing this to end the war, or were they doing this to show the Russians, or to basically end the war faster? You see what I'm saying? Okay. So then now how did diplomacy go? Now this is the big part here. Casablanca, FDR and Churchill are going to meet and basically come down that they need a second front with Stalin to get to, this is the invasion of Italy and the first opening of a second front in France. This is what they're going to, and now Stalin is like, oh, come on, people, I need your help. And the Moscow Conference, U.S. obtains. So like it says, basically, this is the idea that we're talking about, is that we get an assurance from Moscow that they will go to war against Japan once we've defeated Germany. Well, that's that whole, wait, maybe we need to end this war faster to keep the Japanese from being invaded by the Soviet Union as well. The Tehran Conference, this is the big 3 actually meet. So the leaders actually meet, and this is that agreement that Churchill demands that governments in Eastern Europe and Germany basically would have a be able to have their own governments, and Stalin's insisting that the Soviet get control over Eastern Europe, and then Churchill saying no, this needs to be a balance thing. We need to keep them out of our power, out of our they need basically Eastern Europe needs to be free. Okay, and and Roosevelt becomes the mediator between the two and assures that there will be peace within. Go get the dog. In construction out of this UN, and that'd be a peaceful world. The big meeting is Yalta, 1945. The big three actually meet all together. Stalin agreed that he'd enter the Pacific War within 3 months after German surrender, and that the agreement is that Eastern Europe would have free elections, and that it would be able to be self-determined, and that they would reconstitute these areas. Germany would be divided into occupied zones, but eventually be reconstituted in one government set by the people of Germany. And basically Churchill is like, no, this can't happen. But this argument comes from FDR that no, I will make sure that Stalin does what he's supposed to do, and that it'll all be okay. The only problem is in 1945, FDR is going to pass away, and Stalin then is kind of, you get Truman, and then Churchill gets replaced by Attlee, and so there's this whole kind of confusing and that's the beginning of the Cold War, because the idea is that you're going to allow for free elections in Eastern Europe, and you're going to kind of divide up but eventually reunite these areas, and Russia would get some territory that had already lost the Japanese before in the Russo-Japanese War. But with Churchill out of the picture, when Attlee comes in, and then FDR dying and Truman coming in, and Stalin was never going to give them what they wanted. I mean, FDR thought he could control Stalin, but he was never going to control Stalin. So this is where many historians believe that the Cold War actually begins, is at Yalta. I wrote a whole paper on this. I got an A on it. It was amazing. And then, of course, Potsdam is where the Cold War really starts, is that when Clement Attlee shows up and replaces Churchill, and you have Truman shows up and Stalin, it is butting heads almost immediately. Truman is not going to be friendly to him. Truman finds out he has the bomb. Stalin at this point says there's not going to be any reconciliation of Eastern Europe, that he's not going to support pro-government and free elections anytime soon, and that he basically is going to turn Eastern Europe and Germany into a kind of a buffer zone to protect themselves. And though it will start the demilitarization of Germany, and of course the denazification, which we're going to see in the Nuremberg trials. The results of the war, obviously devastating. Russia takes the hugest hit in this war, with 22 million dead. The Poles, Ukrainians, the Holocaust, you're going to see 6 million dead. You're going to see, obviously, Auschwitz is the most notorious of all the death camps. You got cities that are wiped out of existence. Now, there is one part, though, that women, though, are going to play a very big part in this. And you're going to see that this helps the movement of women into economic power, because a lot of these women are not going to leave and these are the middle-class women, again, we talked about. So almost all the countries. Now, Germany is going to be reluctant. Like we saw before, Germany's reluctant about women, but obviously when the war effort gets to the point where they have to have women enter, you're going to see a large number of German women then enter. Italy had done even worse in putting women to work, because they had those laws about marriage and bachelor taxes and all that. But eventually women in Japan, Germany, and Italy will enter the workforce. The one place where you saw women actually in combat. Now, this time you're going to see women in the military. So where you have women that are attachés or drivers, you're going to see women that are nurses, clerks, some receptionists, jobs that then men didn't have to do, could put them into the war effort. And you obviously, Britain will have its own Rosie the Riveters as women go to work in the factories, or even the Queen at one point drove an ambulance during the war effort. So, and there's some really like wild things that go along with England. Like obviously, the King George the Sixth wasn't supposed to be king. His brother Edward was, and he had abdicated because he fell in love with a divorcee who actually turned out to be a Nazi sympathizer. And it turned out that Edward was a Nazi sympathizer and actually had went to Germany and had toured a death camp. And he was actually telling people that they're telling the Germans that they should bomb Britain more. And that was all covered up for a long period of time. So yeah, it was kind of wild. But the one place where women actually were allowed to serve in combat was Russia. And many of the greatest snipers or military officers were actually women in the war effort. So, and by the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union now are toe to toe. We're going to go toe to toe now. So, oops, there we go. We are going to see the beginning of what we call the Nuremberg trials, that we see the war crimes trials, that 22 Nazi criminals are going to be tried in these tribunals. And then this idea that you can basically commit what they call a war crime, a crime against humanity. Goring will kill himself during the trials. Spears, the architect, he's going to end up with a 10-year sentence, I believe. Hess, who is the Hitler's right-hand man, he gets a life imprisonment, and they kept him in prison literally to the day he died. In Buchenwald, the commandant's wife, who was collecting human tattoos by having them killed, the people killed, and having them tanned, their hides. She actually escaped execution. She was called the Bitch of Buchenwald because she got pregnant by a U.S. soldier during her trial. Himmler will kill himself before he goes to trial. And matter of fact, in Japan, Tojo will commit suicide, and then we'll save his life just so we can find him guilty in his war crimes tribunal and then execute him. So this is the beginning of the idea that you commit a crime against humanity and be put on trial for it. The end result, Japan is going to become a democracy. That dropping an atomic bomb and having only the United States build it is going to create a unified Japan and economic power. You're also going to see the Allies are going to divide Germany. And that's going to be the kind of one of the focal points of the Cold War. And we're going to see the beginning of the Cold War, which is obviously what we're going to talk about on Thursday. The biggest thing, why did Germany lose? Well, Germany lost because they were on a three-front war. They were fighting in southern part, they were fighting of Europe in the Balkans, and then they were fighting in Western Europe in France, and they were fighting, and they actually invaded Norway at one time, and the King of Norway himself led the resistance for a long period of time. And they're also going to be fighting, it's actually kind of a four-front war, if you think about it. And they're fighting in Africa, and they're fighting in Russia. Yeah. They're getting punched in the head from all different directions. They had too much territory to control. Once you took it, you had to occupy it. And there were resistance movements. The French had the French resistance. There were what they called fifth columnists in Germany themselves. You had Polish resistance forces. At the same time is the Holocaust, is that you're literally sidetracking shipments of needed material so that you can send what they called freight. You're taking your scientists and you're moving them off to carry out diabolical experiments. Dr. Mengele was doing twin experiments where they were doing, dissecting one twin and studying tissues and bone samples. You had the soldiers that are using that you're maintaining control over places like Buchenwald and Auschwitz. The Holocaust itself diverted materials that would help the war effort, and on top of it, you're killing people because of, well, you think they're Untermensch, and that's just that's just wrong. I mean, and then you had the major blunders, like we said, the Battle of Britain, the invasion of Russia, declaring war on the United States after Japan declared war on the United States. That was not a bright idea on the German part. They sided with Mussolini. Italy had no way could match what the Germans were doing. And so the Italians were like almost like the second fiddle that they had to keep supplying all the time. And of course, just the United States itself, the capability of the United States to build and produce the weapons it needed to fight this war overwhelmed the Germans. So that's it. That's the lecture on World War II. Obviously, we could have gone in a lot more detail, but not really good prime idea for watching. I highly recommend you watch the AP College Board lecture on this. It covers almost the exact same things, but they do a lot of stuff with contextualization and sourcing, and of course, feel free to look up some information about some of the topics, especially the Holocaust, which I wish we could have spent more time on. But like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next unit in the Cold War. So, all right, folks, thank you and hope you enjoyed. And we'll see you on Thursday for the Cold War.